This is Kosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Kosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast. We are joined by all the usual suspects. Bradley, how you doing this week, sir?
Hey, good evening. Doing quite good, thanks.
Mike, how are you doing?
Evening, guys. All well here in Atlanta.
All right. Kyle?
Hi, Mike.
Hey, everybody. How's it going?
Randall? Sir. How are you doing this week?
I'm doing great.
All right.
I am.
What are we going to get into?
Well, I thought we would get into this idea that we are part of a densely populated neighborhood, and this could be a really bad thing, but it could also be a really good thing for a number of reasons. So one of the things I've always liked to do is look for certain events that stand out prominently because of the fact that they have so much significance and so much meaning to them that they're worthy of more in-depth study. I kind of think of them as the cosmic teaching lessons. And one of the most prominent and important and valuable and interesting is something we've already, of course, touched upon, which was the Tunguska Event of 1908, June 30th, 1908. And I thought it would be interesting to delve into that a bit, segue off into that because of the fact that Tunguska has so much insight in that we can derive from it that can now be applied to solving the mystery of the Younger Dryas. I would believe, because there are parallels there. There are parallels between what happened at the Younger Dryas and what happened at Tunguska, just as there are parallels between the Younger Dryas and the KT boundary of 66 million years ago. And just as I think that there might be important lessons relative to the events of the Younger Dryas that we were privileged to witness back in summer of 1994, when we saw the string of pearls, one after another, colliding with Jupiter. So what I would like to do over the next few episodes in trying to create this fully fleshed out context for having an intelligent discussion about these events and these issues is look to those various phenomena that I think provide these parallels, these more in-depth insight into the central question that we've been exploring for weeks now, which is the Younger Dryas. And what I will say again is something I've said over and over again, which I think is worth repeating because it's so important, is that the Younger Dryas is essentially the curtain between this world and the real world of deep history, deep prehistory, which is behind the Younger Dryas and is obscured from our vision by virtue of the fact that the Younger Dryas intervened between the Pleistocene and the Holocene. It set itself right down in the midst of this transition that actually could have been a relatively gentle affair that would have not left a mass extinction episode with some 40 million great animals, killed off from the planet, but would have been much more gentle. And we can actually see that reflected in the ice core graphs, where we begin to see the temperature already rising between 14,600 and 15,000 years ago. And then we see the curve going up, and then we see the sudden interruption of the Younger Dryas, and then coming out of the Younger Dryas, we'll see that curve continuing. If we took the Younger Dryas out of there, that curve would connect just like that, really nice and smooth. And at some point, we will be pulling that graph up again because there's so many lessons to be extracted from it. But then you will see clearly what I'm talking about. So the Younger Dryas is this thing that's suddenly just dropped onto the planet, and everything was altered in a very short period of time, right? And we've talked about the advent of wildfires, and we talked about the amount of biomass burning proxies, which are all of the things like the acetone and the oxalate and the charcoal and the soot and many of these other things that are produced as a byproduct of biomass burning. I don't know if we actually got into the volume of material based upon primarily the amount of soot and charcoal, which suggests approximately 10% of the planetary biomass. Or, well, let me say this, 10% of the amount of soot and charcoal would suggest a combustion of biomass roughly equivalent to 10% of the world's biomass today. So how much is that? Well, think of it this way. If you took the entire continental United States and added through Alaska in the mix, that area is roughly the area of combustion. In other words, cover that area with forests and then burn up the forest. Now imagine, if you will, a firestorm that is burning, a forest fire storm that is burning from a forest that reaches from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border, and then some, right? All of that being burned up would inject the amount of soot and charcoal and other biomass burning proxies into the biosphere as we now find at the Younger Dryas boundary. So that's pretty significant to find that. And then to find that associated with nanodiamonds, magnetic grains, carbon spherules, melt glass, possible, iridium spike, platinum, in some cases ruthenium. So we've got this injection of these platinum group elements, which of course are cosmic. And so something needs to be explained there. Now, the guys who are looking at this are coming from a bunch of different angles. I don't think that there's any consensus that has emerged yet. It's sort of the whole controversy has divided itself into two camps. Just like with the early discussions of the Carolina Bays, you had the two camps formed, the terrestrials and the celestials. The terrestrials, of course, struggled mightily to come up with explanations that would rely on gradualistic, uniform geological processes. The celestials were willing to talk catastrophe. The celestials were generally invoking a multiple Tunguska event, which is still the direction I would lean, in spite of the work of Chris Moore and Davies and the others who are putting it as much older. And that's something we do need to come back to and talk about in depth, as those Carolina Bays, because they are not adequately explained. And somehow I think they do play into this mystery. When the early Carolina Bays were being excavated in the 50s and 60s, and then you had radiocarbon dating come along at that same period, right? What it showed was most of the sedimentary infill. In other words, you've got a basin. It's got sediment in it. In some cases, the sediment has become a total peat. In other cases, there's a swampy, a wetland. In other cases, it's an actual lake. But if you go through the sedimentary infill, you get to this bottom layer of this kind of almost, they described it as almost like packed or even baked clay. They called it humate, right? So if you go through the peat and you get to the sedimentary infill, you get to the humate. Now you begin radiocarbon dating. What was coming up is the majority of those dates were showing late Pleistocene. And I haven't seen recent dates, but if you use alternate dating methods like the optically stimulated luminescence, it's showing a much older feature than the radiocarbon dates. Now, why is that? I think that there's possibly an explanation for that if they were in fact produced by some type of a cosmic event. And that would be something worth exploring. And we'll get into those because my interest in the Carolina Bays literally goes back. I think it was me and my friend Jeremy Lyons, who has disappeared into the wilderness in search of Bigfoot. We haven't heard from him in about 3 years. But anyways, he and I...
What, he's hunting Sasquatch? That's great.
About what?
He's hunting down Sasquatch. We got to talk to him.
He was. Well, if we ever capture something that looks like a Bigfoot human hybrid, he's probably responsible for that. So anyways, it was he and I, we hired a pilot and we went up and we flew over South Georgia, and I took photographs of the Georgia version of the Carolina Bays, which interestingly are not nearly as eccentric as the elliptical bays in North and South Carolina. Plus, their major axis is oriented more north-south than it is northwest-southeast. Now, that's something that Zamora has hit upon, and I think Zamora could be on to something. I haven't really considered his ice boulder hypothesis enough to where I'm going to say I have a legitimate opinion on its veracity. I don't know. It's a possibility. I would say it's worthy of consideration. I know that a number of them do not like Malcolm Lecomte. He's dismissive of the idea, and I haven't discussed with him why. I'd like to say, Malcolm, why do you say that it's impossible and rule it out? Because I don't know, and won't pretend to know without more in-depth study.
I have a quick question though.
Sure.
I don't want to get too far off track, but were you suggesting that maybe luminescence dating can be put off by very bright, is that what you're talking about? That
it depends.
Incoming objects exploding.
It depends on the flux of cosmic ray exposure. So the question is cosmic ray exposure uniformly consistent through time, or can there be variability in the cosmic ray exposure that could bias the dating one way or another? Let's say there's a very intense solar flare. Okay, that affects the amount of cosmic radiation, generally galactic cosmic radiation. If there's a nearby supernova, and I'm not necessarily saying there was a supernova 13,000 years ago, but maybe at some distant point, there would be a galactic cosmic ray flux that could have reached the Earth at some point, maybe even within historical times. I don't know. But what'll happen is when that comes in, generally it's being buffered by the Earth's geomagnetic field and the heliospheric magnetic field of the sun. They both interact. They act as a buffer to the Earth so that the amount of galactic cosmic radiation that comes in that would then interact and create isotopes when it interacts with atmospheric gases is being protected. Now, if you remove if the Earth's geomagnetic field temporarily goes down, what happens? It increases the influx of cosmic radiation. And what does that do? Well, then that increases the nuclear spallation that produces radiocarbon-14 and beryllium-10. So that's my question. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, but give me, maybe by next week at this time, I will be an expert.
But they also,
not,
we talked about Tunguska before. We've talked about how hot they estimate the explosion was, and we're talking about temperatures like the sun.
Yes.
So that would generate these same kinds of cosmic, the same kinds of particles that cause cosmic rays, but right in the atmosphere.
Right. There be neutron bombardment? I think that's very feasible.
Right. Okay.
So Russ, you might have something there. Maybe you could get on that and report back to us next week.
I'll write a paper. It'll be
okay. If you could just write a paper, could you have it peer reviewed by next week? Okay, good. So anyways, I personally, I don't think this is really off the track. All of this is germane to the discussion we're having. If we're going to try to put this into any kind of a form that we can kind of wrap our heads around, I think that the focus is we're trying to understand, we're trying to come up with some kind of a rational explanation for the Younger Dryas events, and lend our efforts to the collective attempt to solve this profound mystery of what happened, and how even the cosmic triggers, if this is what they are, how could they end up with the results that they did, which was a complete reorganization of the planet, a complete reorganization of the planetary environment, of the biosphere. I mean, it was profoundly transformative. And the world is a very different place post-Younger Dryas than pre-Younger Dryas. So I think it would be a valuable thing to try to really understand. And then when we get back to this idea that we have to go back maybe as far as 5 million years to find an episode of comparable severity, which was the Hemphill climate catastrophe that occurred about 5 million years ago, and it was a mass extinction event that now appears. And of course, 5 million years ago, our dating isn't going to be as precise as 12,000 years ago, but it does appear that there were some major climatic and planetary perturbations. At the same time, there was a mass extinction episode that was roughly the scale of the terminal Pleistocene extinction. And that was called the Hemphill Extinction, and it happened basically 5 million years ago. So when we talk about the Younger Dryas, if we're talking about and using the loss of species as our yardstick for determining severity, right? Well, loss of species implies loss of habitat. And so we're just referring to biomass burning up half the North American continent in one firestorm. And then we be talking about, there's no event of that magnitude, even if we're talking about that much biomass. And I'm not necessarily saying that all that biomass was concentrated in one area. We're talking about the totality of biomass combustion that was occurring. So was there firestorms in Europe, South America? Probably were. Were there places that survived? Probably were. I mean, places that were refugium, where you might have had both species of flora and fauna that survived. And from those places of refuge, radiate outwards to repopulate the desert, the devastated wasteland, right? But in any case, we're talking about something, if you have an event that would burn up 10% of the planetary biomass, you're certainly talking about an event that definitely involves the entire planet. You don't have an event of that scale that isn't going to have planetary implications, right? So we have this gradual warming and the gradual shrinking of the ice, and then suddenly it's interrupted by this thing. And when this thing is over, 40 million great megafauna are now gone, totally erased from the global, the planetary ecosystem, completely. Every single one gone, right? That needs explanation. And when you consider that the dominant explanation for that for decades now, up until maybe a decade ago, was that, Birkenstock wearing hunters with spears hunted all these animals to extinction. Well, we've really been down, accepting that without very much critical thought at all. Just, oh yeah, well, look, humans showed up the same time that the animals disappeared. In some cases, yes. In other cases, probably not. And it's always been assumed that humans showed up in America just when all the great megafauna disappeared. And where the models got after more precise dating was that the Paleo-Indian hunters came across the Bering Land Bridge, sometime when this ice-free corridor opened up. They came across the Bering Land Bridge, and of course, as they're coming across Siberia, they're slaughtering every single mammoth, every single dire wolf, every single woolly rhino, every single basically large animal, with the exceptions of the ones that are still extant today, come across the Bering Land Bridge, wiping out everything, coming into Alaska and the northern Yukon, wiping out everything, sweeping down through the ice-free corridor, wiping out everything in their path, coming into non-glaciated North America, wiping out everything from the Gulf of Mexico in the south to the Atlantic on the east to the Pacific on the west, sweeping down through Mexico, obliterating everything in Mexico, coming back all the way through South America and down to Tierra del Fuego, wiping out, exterminating half the great megafauna till there was not one left, and they did all this in 1,000 years.
And they buried them in sediment as well.
Yeah. And they did this wearing Birkenstocks, as I said.
And I mean, horses and camels.
Horses and camels and giant ground sloths and Castoroides, the giant beaver, and the giant armadillos, and on 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 and on. Yes. So come on. I just ain't buying it, guys. No. And see, part of it all depended upon the chronometry of it, right? You had to be able to show that the animals in Siberia went down before the animals in Beringia. You had to show that they went down before the animals in Alaska, who would have gone extinct before the animals, say, in Arizona, right? Because of the fact that you've got this wave of immigrants coming across, and they're slaughtering everything as they go, right? So obviously then they had to slaughter all the Siberian megafauna first, followed by the Alaskan and the megafauna in the Yukon and that area, and then you would have followed by non-glaciated North America, and then Central America, and then South America. It should have been last, right? Well, that's not showing up. That's now that we've got dating, it's looking like the extinctions happened in Siberia that same time they happened in South America. So what happens now, for multiple reasons, is that the so-called overkill hypothesis, the humans as super predator hypothesis, the blitzkrieg hypothesis, what has happened with more dating, along with a lot of other evidence as well, has become extremely unviable. Because for one thing, we know that late Pleistocene humans, Clovis people, etc., they had a very diversified diet. We can tell from the what they were eating, from their campsites, even from their coprolites, that they were eating a very diversified diet. A lot of small game, fish, right? All of this. They weren't eating exclusively woolly mammoths.
So what Larry said to Mo, what do you feel like for lunch today? Mastodon?
Yeah, well, it was, mastodon and eggs for breakfast, mastodon and burgers for lunch, mastodon meatloaf for dinner. I read a study years ago by a Russian, God, what was he? I don't remember who he was, but he wrote a paper trying to figure out how much mammoth meat. So he tried to figure out the number of people in the world, number of mammoths, how many pounds of mammoth meat there would have been, and how many they would have to consume every day in order to eat all the mammoths to extinction. And it was pretty phenomenal. It worked out to be something like 10 or 12, the equivalent of like 10 or 12 McDonald's quarter pounders every day. And I was like, I don't know, man. I don't know.
Even that seems pretty small.
Well, it was something like they had to eat, according to his calculation, I think it was like 6 or 8 pounds of mammoth meat. Every person had to eat 6 to 8 pounds of mammoth meat every day.
It'd still be a lot of people.
Would be a lot of people, yeah. And yeah, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. The more you look at it, the less sense it makes. Now, you couple that mass extinction with the fact that you've got all of this other evidence happening, that there was some kind of a global transformative event that took place. Well, and then we've certainly talked about the evidence for it could have been missed for the simple reason that, what you had multiple pockets of survivors. So it wasn't like the whole population was reduced. I mean, the population might have been reduced by 90%. But if that other 10% was genetically diverse and widely dispersed geographically, we could miss a genetic bottleneck if we're not really even looking for it. And so I don't even think that we don't even need to necessarily say there was a genetic bottleneck in order to say that the human population was reduced by some substantial number, 3/4 or 90%. But certainly, we've looked at some of the preliminary evidence, like from the work of David Anderson and others, that we certainly see very strong and convincing evidence in North America that there was a human population crash. And what we've talked about, the disappearance of the Clovis, boom, they're gone. Suddenly, for 300 years, they're all prolifically, dispersed across non-glaciated North America. Their campsites, their quarries, their garbage pits, all of that active, going along, radiocarbon dating showing 300 years of cultural activity, and then they're gone, instantly gone. And their disappearance coincides precisely with the disappearance of the megafauna. So rather than the Clovis hunters being the ones responsible for exterminating the megafauna, I would say it's more likely that they were actually victims of the same events that the megafauna succumbed to. Then we get into the black mat layer, and we see that black mat layer defines both the stratigraphy, the megafaunal stratigraphy below, the Clovis stratigraphy below, but not above. And then we look close at that black mat layer, and then what begins to reveal itself? The fingerprints of cosmic catastrophe, the nanodiamonds, the microspherules, the magnetic grains, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Typically anywhere from 10 to, say, 100 to 1,000 times greater than the background, the normal background deposition of these materials, non-black matte. So, it's all beginning to point to something much, much larger, something much more dramatic and grand that we need to begin expanding our thinking in order to wrap our heads around it. Otherwise, it's going to be too big for us, and we're going to miss it. And we're going to come up with these faux explanations like, roving bands of Paleo-Indian hunters. So getting back to Tunguska, the value of Tunguska in 1908. Let's get into that a little bit. Let's get a little bit into understanding more about the cosmic environment, because for me to come up with any kind of a coherent explanation for these events that we're looking at, we have to look at this bigger picture, which means we have to begin to look at what we now know about the cosmic environment. And what we now know about the cosmic environment may actually be enhanced by considering what ancient peoples in archaic times might have known about the cosmic environment. Does it make sense?
Yes, sir.
It's
Absolutely.
quiet. All silent.
We're all stunned in awe.
Oh, well. Okay. So, 1801. What happened in 1801? First asteroid was discovered. Ceres. First asteroid, 1801. And then the second one was not discovered until 1898. And that was Eros. And it was actually the first asteroid ever seen approaching the Earth, which caused a small amount of concern. Then, 1932, Apollo, first asteroid that was seen to cross the Earth's orbit. That was 1932. First asteroid that was seen to cross Earth's orbit. By 1970, there were about 30 near-Earth asteroids, or NEOs, that had been documented. About 30. This is 1970, right? Me and Mike are around then. I'm a year out of high school. Mike's maybe 2 years out of. I don't think the rest of you guys were here in 1970.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, you were okay. Yeah, you were here.
Brad was here, but he was very small.
Very small.
Right. Very small. Yes. Probably sitting in his crib in his diaper. About that time of life, huh? Okay, so me and Mike. So that was 70 was the year, the summer, that I spent pretty much the whole summer traveling and hiking over the western states. And that summer was critical and pivotal why we're sitting here today, because of the things that I saw and experienced and wondered about, which triggered a lifetime of interest in matters of geology, primarily at that point. And so in upcoming episodes, I'll be referring back to that summer, because a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, I first saw that summer without having any idea whatsoever that I would ever have anything like a coherent explanation for what I was seeing. In other words, when I passed through the Columbia Gorge, the magnificent, awesome Columbia Gorge with these great delta fans splayed out from the valleys, I knew that there was some kind of story there, but it was so on such a scale that at the time my mind almost rejected, like the sense that, well, whatever it was, I could never know that. But it was something. And years later, of course, now I know what we're seeing there. But in the summer of 1970, I wouldn't have had any forethought that I would have ever looked at that feature and had an idea of what processes led to that as a result, as a final result. And now, of course, I know that if you take 100, 200 million cubic feet per second, you backflood it into a tributary valley, then you supplement it with intense precipitation, and that flows back out, that it's going to carry a lot of sediment with it, and it's going to splay it out into the main trunk valley. And that's what I was looking at. But when you're looking at a delta fan that's miles wide and hundreds of feet thick, it's on such a grand scale that, you just can't wrap your head around it. This is the value of referring to the microscale stuff that we're going to do. We're going to kind of get saturated in looking at the scale invariant nature of these geological formations, because they do manifest scale invariance very prominently. And so you can recreate a landscape like on a stream table that uses diatomaceous earth. You can literally reduplicate an entire landscape, fluvially created landscape. And all of the features would be there that you would see, that you could translate up into the macro and mega scale, and boom, there it is. But the problem is people, we're like almost like microbes on the back of some of these features that are such a grand scale that, we're just looking at one little slice and not necessarily seeing the big picture. Bradley and I have spent, 23 years now, 24 years traversing these landscapes and digesting what we're seeing, processing what we're seeing, right? I would say that it's safe to say that we're probably now in kind of an elite group that have spent as much time in the field as just about anybody looking at landscapes of catastrophe and attempting to interpret those landscapes of catastrophe. And one of the most effective tools we have for that is the fact of scale invariance. By seeing that we can recreate these gigantic landscapes that are too large to see from the human scale, to perceive from the human scale, we can recreate those in the laboratory. Or we can even recreate them. Nature will do that for us, because anybody can walk down to any stream channel that has a sandbar, and after a heavy rainfall, you can go in there and you can see everything. You can see cataracts, you can see coulees, you can see slot canyons, you can see splayed out debris fans, you can see longitudinal lineations, you can see current ripples. It's all right there. Then we can take a satellite photograph showing 100 square miles or more. And if you don't have something by which to judge the scale of that thing you're looking at, it could be a photograph taken of a sandbar next to a little creek, and you blow it up 1 million times. And now you're looking at this phenomenon on a much, much grander scale. That's the power of this scale invariance, see, is because we can recreate all of that. And now it can help us to extend our vision beyond just the limited human scale, which of course we're also doing technologically. Look, when was the first time we started taking photographs from space? We weren't doing that when I came into the world. That was not something. Humans did not have the perspective of outer space when I was born. Now we do, right? That itself is a pretty significant transformation of human consciousness, that we can pull up Google Earth now and we can begin to see things. I see things on Google Earth now all the time that I now recognize from having been down, immersed onto the landscape itself, absorbing the messages, absorbing the storylines encoded into the landscape. Now you look at it from the perspective of photography from space and Google Earth and so on. You can go, oh my gosh, there we see, look at current ripples here. Over here, 1,000 miles away, there's the same thing, more current ripples. So you see, we're in this unique position. We couldn't even be having this conversation when I was a kid, because we didn't have the eyes to see. We didn't have the data at our disposal that we now have. So we couldn't have this conversation. So we're in a unique position. We're the first generation of people on this earth in maybe 12,000 or 13,000 years that can have an intelligible conversation about global catastrophes in a scientific sense. And now we're realizing that, this planet is a very dynamic place, and it is part of a much larger ecosystem that involves the cosmic domain. And our ancestors understood that. And so once you get that, then the mystery you begin to realize that the mystery starts to open up as to why, for example, you have megalithic structures all over the ancient world that are astronomical maps, that are oriented to specific sighting lines to demarcate a celestial geometry, a celestial sphere that is navigable and predictable. And then you realize that those lines of orientation that were set down by these megalithic structures in the ancient structures 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, people were laying out structures to define the key astronomical lines that are still being used by astronomers today to recreate the celestial sphere, right? And within that celestial sphere, you have all the data, you have the grid lines that you need to track cosmic motion, right? So it's like we're still doing it, but on a much more sophisticated level. And what we're doing is we're now taking an archaic model of the world and we're translating it into a 21st century version. And what it's going to reveal to us is basically that world that the survivors looked out upon, knowing that something had just happened that involved an interaction with the cosmos, or those who preceded the catastrophe. Because here's the thing that people have to understand, and here is a solution to part of the mystery that Graham Hancock has talked about so often when he's talking about, when we go back to the very beginnings of recorded history and what we see happening there. It's like, okay, we're seeing the beginnings of history. Okay, the beginnings of history. Suddenly you've got massive ziggurats going up in the valley of the Tigris-Euphrates. You've got the extraordinary temples being built in Indochina. You have the first wave of monumental earthwork architecture in North America. You have the Old Kingdom on the Giza Plateau. And all of this is now happening. And within that context, you now have the emergence of writing. So we have architecture and we have writing emerging at the same time, right? And what Graham said, well, we always think of that as the beginning of history, you know. Well, something doesn't jive there. Okay, so we're saying that there were subsistence farmers living in the Nile Valley, and this is what they had been doing for generation after generation. And then 2 generations go by, and they're building 482-foot tall, perfectly aligned, perfectly geometrical pyramids, extraordinarily massive structures that would have taken a huge social organization, sheathed in white limestone that would have been virtually impenetrable, shining in the sunlight, right? Incredible structures that would have been taxed the full resources of modern societies to recreate and reproduce, if we could even do it. And it doesn't make sense. And Graham was pointing this out, you know, back 25 years ago. And he was saying, maybe what we're really seeing here is not so much the beginning of history as the end of history, of another history, an alternate history, a lost history. And of course, he got savaged by mainstream because of that. But I think he's going to be proven right, that really there is much more to the story than conventional academia has been willing to acknowledge or to recognize. And this thing goes very deep into the past. And what has obscured our vision is the Younger Dryas. This curtain that came down on the Pleistocene world, the same world that exterminated the megafauna, caused the disappearance of the Clovis, may have caused the extinction of a civilization. May have. I say may have, okay? I'm saying that this is a hypothesis that's worthy of testing, that's worthy of setting up as a model to be explored, that there may have been much, much more than we have assumed that was going on. Yes, was there a Stone Age existence? Absolutely. But, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, you had technologically advanced civilizations right next to Stone Age civilizations, right? The fact that there was a Stone Age civilization, and still today, Stone Age civilizations, then the presence of a Stone Age civilization then does not, say, rule out the existence of a technological civilization. And of course, here when I say technological civilization, I think a lot of people are going to immediately start picturing our version of a technological civilization. There perhaps is parallel paths to civilization that don't look anything like what we've seen in the last half millennia. So what that brings us to is this back to the question that we're examining here. We are trying to understand what it was that caused this planetary transformation. And maybe once we have a better handle on that, we can now tackle some of the other questions. But it does certainly seem to me integral to the discussion.
I just want to make a comment about the technological advancement, the technological civilizations. I think it's incredibly unlikely that two different civilizations would ever develop technology in the same manner to be recognizable between the two. When you look back at our technological advancements and these people, very few people that were just key in inventions or certain ideas that really completely changed the course of history or technological advancement. Without those people, our own technological advancement would look so different than it does today.
Yes.
So it seems the most likely scenario is that we wouldn't recognize it as being similar to our own.
Yeah. I mean, are we going to declare definitively that there couldn't be an advanced technological civilization that was supported and maintained by something other than fossil fuels? Are we going to rule that out? Well, no. Right there, that would imply that it could look drastically different. And if there are other ways of tapping, because basically what sustains our modern civilization is our ability to tap into one particular form of energy. Well, if we had an alternate form of methodology for tapping into energy in one of its alternate forms, yeah, we might come up with a technology and a civilization that doesn't look anything like ours. And 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years later, given that you not only have that you would literally in that time have multiple catastrophes, and that, of course, is again one of the key points here is that there have been multiple catastrophes, just like Plato said, just like he quoted the ancient Egyptian priest saying that, yeah, there have been many catastrophes that have wiped out civilizations before yours. I think perhaps there is a considerable amount of literal truth to that Plato was reporting there. And so, yeah, again, the idea that there could be completely alternative ways of exploiting the energy resources of the earth or the cosmos and yielding up a civilization that looks drastically different and that might not leave the kind of a footprint that would be easily discernible, 15 or 20,000 years later, especially if you had an ice age and gigantic floods and everything else intervening.
Especially not the, transient energies or whatever. If you're collecting energy from the sun, you don't need giant mines and quarry sites and all of that type of stuff to get materials or wells or,
Yeah.
Yeah, and if they had metal artifacts, they would be long gone, except for any gold ones. Metal just doesn't last that long.
Yeah. No, it doesn't. So back to the discovery of near-Earth objects, we found out by 1970, there were 30 near-Earth objects known, asteroidal in character. By 1990, there were 135 known, right? So roughly, 3-4 times as many in 20 years. By 1999, 400 were known. How many are known now? Well, we'll see here at the end of our episode today. We'll look at a little, it's a JPL animation, I believe, and it'll kind of give people the idea of, yes, it's a much more densely populated universe that we live in, or at least the solar system. So by the end of the century, the turning of the millennium, there was now over 400 near-Earth objects, NEOs, that were known. When I first compiled this, which had to have been, at least a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago, and I haven't updated it since, there were 1,500 NEOs that were known, 1,500 near-Earth objects.
What were they saying was the percentage that they had found? Any idea?
I don't recall that. I think at that point it was like, oh my gosh, there's a way more of these things than we thought there were. Which is, of course, true. And I don't know what the current thinking is as to the total number, but it's pretty substantial. But this is the actual, by I think around 2010, there had been 15 that had actually been, 1,500 that had been actually documented. So we go back to 1801. That was the first asteroid discovered, 1801. So a little bit, by 200 years later, by 2001, there's 1,500 of them known. See, so again, our technology is expanding our ability to see dimensions of reality that we couldn't perceive, 200 years ago. So, I think.
Well, before you get into a slideshow, we can take a break here. If we had a little more wrap up before you move on, but yeah, we're just about that point.
Well, let's take a little break, and then we'll come back. We'll look at some slides, and we'll discuss some of the eyewitness accounts of Tunguska.
Excellent. And we do want to talk a little bit about the trips that are coming up.
Oh yeah.
And some of the other new things that we got going on when we come back.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Before we get back into the roundabout Tunguska discussion, I wanted to mention the Scablands trip, which is coming up. You can go to contactatthecabin.com and click on the Scablands event at the top. We have opened up a second week, which is going to take place September 28th through October 3rd there in Soap Lake, Washington, where Randall will be taking us and showing us some of these features in the landscapes that illustrate the scale invariance and give us a firsthand experience of these things so we can start to have that in our own minds going throughout the world. Anything?
Yeah. So it would be a preliminary tour of the great Pacific Northwest floodlands. And of course, in one week, we're only going to be able to see a portion of it because the phenomena is so vast. But then we could perhaps then in the spring or next summer, we'd do a follow-up trip so that people could get the whole picture. The problem is we have to cover Washington, northern Idaho, eastern Montana, western Alberta, southern British Columbia before we get the full picture. So I guess we're going to have to just start doing tours about once every other week.
Sounds great to me. I'm in.
But yeah, check that out. Contactatthecabin.com. There are spots open for the second week, so get a hold of Darren at Grimerica. What's the email?
It's Darren at Grimerica.com. And I think there's links on contactatthecabin.com to email him or to contact him to tell him you want a spot. So
yeah.
So now Darren has reserved the entire complex there, hasn't he? At the southern end of Soap Lake for the crew, for the team, the people to stay at?
I think so.
Right.
It's the Soap Lake Lodge, I think it is.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And it's a complex of big log structure buildings, really nice place. It's going to be a great place to use as a base from which to go out every day exploring in a different direction and seeing a different suite of phenomenal features. And then by the end of the 5 days, you'll have had a pretty good broad overview of at least one dimension of this vast complex in the landscape. Grand Coulee, Moses Coulee, spectacular.
It'll end up being about the same amount of time as we were able to spend with Graham and Santha Hancock in 2014 when he was writing Magicians of the Gods. So we'll be able to see a lot of that same territory that we covered with them.
Dry Falls, Cataract, Potholes Cataract, Wallula Gap, Steptoe Butte. I mean, it's an amazing itinerary.
Yep, and the itinerary is laid out there on the website, contactatthecabin.com, for anyone who's interested.
So are you guys going to be participating?
Oh yeah.
I guess.
Look, try to carve
We
out a
need
little
you.
time, can you? You guys are driving the buses, right?
That's right.
All right.
Your lives will be in our hands, people.
Well, listen, we survived this southern Colorado last May, so here
That's
we
right.
are.
That's right.
So my
We have
confidence,
experience.
I was a little nervous, I will admit, going into it. I didn't know you guys that well, but by the end of the 10 days, I was feeling pretty relaxed and at ease. All right, I'll still be alive at the end of this trip.
Yeah.
Yeah, it took us about that long to get over the shock as well.
Yeah.
That's right.
Meeting you and
Yeah.
it was, but yeah, turned out all right.
Hey,
Randall was like, I'm in your van. Which van is Brad going in?
yeah,
Like,
which
Brad's
van?
going to be in Kyle's van. Oh.
Is that what I said? Well, look, I probably logged up 100,000 miles with Brad behind the wheel. So at this
Right.
point, I'm pretty well,
Yeah.
Now there's this new variable in the equation.
Yeah. Who is this guy?
Who is this guy that's got my life in his hands? And driving up some of those switchback roads up there on Mesa Verde,
yeah.
I was like,
Yep.
okay. Hey, guys, that was a pretty awesome trip, wasn't it?
It was
was.
amazing.
Oh,
So
man, yeah, I think about that, yeah. Those
So I
treks up
can't wait-
Chimney Rock.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
gosh.
I can't wait to do this again at the end of this year. It's gonna
Oh,
be,
I know.
It's going to be
I know.
fantastic.
I tell you, I know. And this is going to be, yeah. And see, the thing was, the first group, I confess, I had never been to Mesa Verde, right? So I had to do a lot of background research and things to really know. But now we did 3 excursions there. So I was able, the first excursion, I would say, okay, here's the road log. Oh, and here's the real thing. Here's what's going on. So by the time we did the third excursion, I was getting to be almost an authority. But yeah, it was grand, wasn't it?
It was.
And Chimney Rock looking out over
Yeah.
the It was
Yep.
fantastic.
And there are pictures of that trip also on that website, so people can see how much fun we had, and that it gives you an idea of how much fun this next one is going to be. So
Yeah, and really, with the place we're staying itself is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's pictures of that on the website too. So check it
Good.
out.
Okay. Awesome.
Well, and there are going to be galleries on the new RandallCarlson.com website also of some of the trips that we've taken all the way back to 23 years, but then definitely a whole group of them from Ghost Springs last year also. And Randall did mention that last week or last episode, that'd be another week or two. I know we've said that several times, but the countdown is on. It will be functional soon, and you'll be able to look at some of those pictures right there on randallcarlson.com, access all the podcasts, and it's going to be a happening place. And there's lots of different directions that it's going to grow soon also as we grow with the podcast. So part of that, we also want to thank the Patreon subscribers. That's continued to grow.
Absolutely.
We really appreciate that. And we actually recorded a little segment before this show tonight that's going to be released to those Patreon people. So you do finally have another little perk coming your way.
I just want to comment, Brad, that I keep like flashing over there, and as you're sitting there now, it really does appear as if you've got this fireball headed straight for your skull. And I'm almost expecting it to puncture the left side there, and then we see it coming out the right side. It's what it looks like to me. Maybe we should do an animated version of that. But
well, you had it for a couple episodes there where you had your background, and
yeah,
how Yukataki was coming from both sides. It was like the Steve Martin, with the arrow.
Oh, right. That was not, I didn't plan that ahead of time, by the way. It just happened. Okay. So, Tunguska, I think we should talk some more about Tunguska, because Tunguska is going to basically give us a considerable amount of insight into our Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Okay. And I think what I'll do is pull up a share screen here, and we'll look at a map. We'll do this so we can see Siberia and Lake Baikal right there, the deepest lake on Earth, by the way, right there. And I don't remember exactly how deep it is, but I wouldn't want to have to swim to the bottom. Lake Baikal, it's in a rift in the Baikal rift system. So it's a rift that's essentially opened up in the crust. It's now filled with water. And I don't know the story there, but I'm about 99.99% certain that there's a story there. In other words, a story that probably involves some type of catastrophic series of events.
5,387 feet.
So it's more than a mile deep.
That's what I was going to say. I think it's a mile deep, and it's probably twice as deep as the second deepest lake in the world.
Wow. So
the deepest one in North America is just over 2,000.
And which one is that?
Oh, it's the Slave Lake up there.
Great Slave Lake. And see, the Great Slave Lake, along with the Great Bear Lake, yes, there's definitely a story there.
Definitely.
And when we start talking about global mega floods, and I know I keep referring to this, but we are going to be talking about global mega floods. And I would even venture to predict that we will talk more about global mega floods here on this site than any other venue anywhere right now on the internet.
No doubt.
Anyways, here we go. Here's the blast zone right here, sort of just north and a little to the west of Lake Baikal. And that's right at the edge of the taiga forests. North of there is tundra, south of there is forest. So if it had been, as we think we talked about maybe last week, if it had been any further north, you wouldn't have had the pattern of tree destruction that has yielded up so much insight into the nature of this event. So here's a closer look. You can see Lake Baikal right there. And these are a series of, in other words, what they did was the scientists who have been studying this early on, they actually went and got eyewitness accounts. And they began to catalog the eyewitness accounts. Like, what did you see? And they proceeded to describe what they saw. And one of the things that was of greatest interest to the scientists was, where did it come from, right? And so the direction that it came from evolved to finally this longest arrow here shows the greatest amount of its length is representative of the greatest amount of eyewitness accounts that are now consistent with that being the general direction of that the thing emerged from, the object. And this object, I mean, this image, if follow my cursor right around here, is what they call the butterfly. And within this butterfly, all of the forest was blown down, right? So this area of almost total destruction within there. And you'll know this, where it says Kulik's route, that was Leonid Kulik, who was the first scientist to actually reach the site of devastation. And I've always thought, since I first started learning about this, decades ago, was, God, what this needs to be a movie or a mini series. I mean, it could be as compelling as the Game of Thrones, but every bit of it true. The heroic effort, repeated, the first efforts and the failures and the repeated efforts where he finally got this arduous journey to this remote region, and he mounted the ridge and looked over the ridge, and as far as the eye could see, a massive sea of blown down forest, and his observations and his impressions and his emotional reaction to what he was seeing is compelling stuff. And it really could. I mean, there's so much interesting stuff out there that could serve as that could be presented now in story form, that it's to me almost tragic that there's such now little originality in Hollywood when you have this tremendous untapped reservoir of stuff, and this is just one example. I could probably come up with 10 more examples of things, but this is one example. Tell the story of Leonid Kulik in The Mystery of the Tunguska. Open with the scene of the Tunguska tribesmen just going about their daily routine, the reindeer herders and stuff, there at their huts, gathering food from their gardens, tending their reindeer, getting up in the morning, sun's coming up, and then suddenly the heavens opened up and fire pours out and this tremendous thing happens. And now it's going to take, another 19 years before Leonid Kulik actually makes it to the site. And some of the details of that story are pretty amazing. Anyways, let's go on. It shows Kulik's route here as he came in and explored. And, so this was a situation where day after day, he's traversing this landscape of utter devastation. So what he was seeing was unique. Not too many human beings had seen anything like this alive on the earth at that time or since then. I mean, the closest you might get to this would be, maybe the destruction of Hiroshima or Nagasaki by an atomic bomb, or perhaps if you were walking the aftermath of the Great Chicago Fire, although the Great Chicago Fire in its area of devastation was minuscule compared to this. Boom, let's go. So, Krinov, one of the best books on this, translated from the Russian back in 1966. I think probably this was maybe the second or third book I read on the subject. The following appeared in the paper Siberia on July 2nd, 1908. Now get this, July 2nd. So it's only 3 days after the event. Written by a correspondent named Kulesh. At the beginning of the 9th hour, in the morning of 17 June, which is the old calendar there. This corresponds to 30th of June in our modern Gregorian calendar, just so don't get confused there. At the beginning of the 9th hour, in the morning of 17 June, a most unusual phenomena of nature was observed here. In the village of Nizhny Kralinsk, in the northwest, quite high above the horizon, the peasants saw a body shining very brightly, too bright for the naked eye, with a bluish white light. It moved vertically downwards for about 10 minutes. The body was in the form of a pipe, that is, cylindrical. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share there.
10 minutes. Wow.
Well, as you're going to see, this, of course, is not accurate.
Okay.
I was going to point that out. It was not 10 minutes. That would have been something if it was.
Yeah, I was going to say, they're seeing it from way out in space.
Yeah, that would. Yeah, no, not 10 minutes. But see, this is the press. This was copied from a press. Three days after, you've got,
yes,
so and so said so and so and so and so, and they report on the story. Then the story is actually,
put in a book.
Yeah,
and then somebody has to translate the book, and yeah.
So okay. Right. It was not 10 minutes, but it was actually a pretty long time. Proportionately, it was a lot of it. Some people, depends on where you were. Like, if, for example, if you were in an area, say to the southwest, when that thing is coming in, you had the potential to see it much longer than if you were beyond the trajectory of it, and you basically maybe saw a distant light in the sky. But then, of course, once it exploded, now, if you were looking in that direction, you would have seen a brilliant ball, and depending on how far away you were, that ball could have been as bright as the sun or even much brighter.
Well, and if the calendar was off 2 weeks for the 17th to the 30th, then that July 3rd date would be 2 weeks off too. So it wasn't really just 3 days later. It would have been, right, 2 weeks and a couple days later.
Well, the thing is, see, this is, okay, so it says, this is from Krinov's 1966 book. So it appeared in the paper on July 2nd. So yeah, that could be a good point. Right. Yeah, probably so. So actually, then this is 2 weeks later, not 3 days later.
Yeah.
Unless,
Minor point,
See-
but yeah.
well, the thing is, though, this is part of the translation that was 1966. So when he says July 2nd, is he using the old calendar or the new calendar? I don't know. It doesn't really matter too much. But I want to call attention to this idea of a cylindrical pipe. When I was a kid, my grandfather grew up in rural Sweden, and there were, huge lakes there. And he told this story to me multiple times, that one time he was out walking and it was at night. I don't remember what he was doing when he was a kid. And he said this big, he called it a pipe. He said it was like a big tube or a pipe, and it was on fire. And he watched it go over his head, and then it went down into the lake that he was walking by. And he told me that multiple times, because that's why I remember it quite well. And that always, I remember I found that imagery. I was trying to, as a kid, maybe 6, 7 years old, the first time he told it to me, and I'm trying to envision, what the hell is he talking about? I probably didn't think specifically in those terms at 6 or 7, but that's what I was wondering. And if I had the words at that, the vocabulary at the time, that's probably how I would have phrased it to myself. But see, years now later, I'm still thinking about that, and having now seen a number of, fireball phenomena myself, and having read so many accounts of what people saw, I'm convinced that, yeah, that's what he saw. And it was probably an illusion, thinking that it went into the lake, because one of the things about when you see these fireballs, especially if they're descending to the horizon, is they always look way closer than they actually are. People are always thinking, oh, it was just over the next hill. You see that. But then you realize, you do the calculations, the entry trajectory calculations, and the damn thing was 40 miles away. But it was right over the next hill. So we all got out and went in our carriages and rode over looking for the thing. Well, no, you still would have need to have gone another 30, 40, 50 miles. But this is a very common thing to think that it was.
Yeah, especially if you couldn't see, if the lake went to the horizon.
Right. Okay, so what they saw then was this thing that was a body in the form of a pipe that is cylindrical. Then it goes on to say that it was hot and dry when the shining body approached the ground, which was covered with forest at this point. It seemed to be pulverized, and in its place a huge cloud of black smoke was formed, and a loud crash, not like thunder, but as if from the fall of large stones or from gunfire was heard. All the buildings shook, and at the same time a forked tongue of flame broke through the cloud. All the inhabitants of the village ran out into the street in panic. The old women wept. Everyone thought that the end of the world was approaching. In the end, it was decided to send a messenger to Kurensk to find out the meaning of this phenomena. Now, when we get into these accounts of these celestial phenomena, over and over and over again, common theme, people think it's the end of the world. Right? So then there was a letter to Kulik. This was one of the critical letters. This was sent to Leonid Kulik. It was dated the 21st of November, 1921. Okay. And this is what the letter said. The Evenki people who are camping on the Podkamennaya Tunguska describe how strong air pressure laid low a strip of forest and killed several reindeer belonging to one of the Evenki, Ivan Ilyich. Now, that was the first thing that alerted him to there might be something interesting going on up there, because he had the assignment of documenting these meteorite falls in Russia. That was kind of one of the things he had been tasked with. And so he was now putting out there that he was interested in anything that people had seen or had witnessed or anything. This letter represents his first awareness of the Tunguska event. Now we get to Astapowicz, who wrote one of the first articles in English after, because the first scientific articles didn't come out until the late 20s and early 1930s in Russia. And then, of course, we have the Depression setting in, and there just wasn't the scientific attention or resources or anything to really investigate this thing at that time, right? So this was from 1934. This was published in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society. And the title of the article was Airwaves Caused by the Fall of the Meteorite on 30th June 1908 in Central Siberia. And here's the quote. The flight and fall of the meteorite on the 30th of June 1908, amongst the greatest meteoric phenomena known to mankind, must occupy one of the foremost places because of the magnitude of the phenomena accompanying its movement through the atmosphere. It is unlikely that our generation may again be witnesses of a similar meteoric phenomena. If it had occurred 4 hours, 47 minutes later, when the city of Leningrad would have lain on the same parallel near the center of the explosion, our knowledge of it would probably have been considerably more extensive. On July 13th, 1908, and I'm going to guess that this is probably, again, I'm not sure if this is which calendar this is, but it was reprinted in Krinov's book, Giant Meteorites, that devoted a whole section to the Tunguska event. Right, so this was one of the Krasnoyarets was a newspaper. So this was dated July 13th, reprinted in Giant Meteorites. So this again is a report. It may not be exactly accurate, but it begins to kind of convey the sense, the first early glimmerings of understanding here. Kazhemsk village, the 17th. So the 17th again, of course, is the old calendar. An extraordinary atmospheric phenomena was noticed in this region. At 7:43 a.m., a noise as a strong wind was heard, followed immediately by a fearful crash accompanied by a subterranean shock which caused buildings to tremble. One had the impression that some huge beam or heavy stone had struck the building. This was followed by two further equally forceful blows. The interval between the first and the third blows was accompanied by an extraordinary underground roar, like the sound of a number of trains passing simultaneously over the rails. And then, for 5 or 6 minutes, followed by a sound like artillery fire. Between 50 and 60 bangs, becoming gradually fainter, while the ground trembled. That would be leave quite an impression on a person, I would think. And this is something, again, that we hear repeatedly, is this idea that there was a subterranean component to this thing. It wasn't merely atmospheric. It was translated literally into the crust of the earth, and people felt like it was moving through the crust of the earth, describing it was as if simultaneously these number of trains passing over the rails, except under the ground. I find that very interesting. And then when we get into
last week that was the center of the Siberian traps there, so there could be all kinds of strange faulting and
yes.
Structures underneath, that could have been affected by that.
Exactly, Brad. Exactly. As eyewitnesses relate, it goes on, before the first bangs were heard, a heavenly body of a fiery appearance cut across the sky from south to north, inclined to the northeast. Neither its size nor shape could be made out, owing to its speed and particularly its unexpectedness. However, many people in different villages distinctly saw that when the flying object touched the horizon, a huge flame shot up that's cut the sky in two. The glow was so strong that it was reflected in rooms whose windows faced north. Apparently, the glow continued for at least a minute, since many peasants in the fields noticed it. The bangs were heard as soon as the tongue of flame disappeared. On the island opposite the village, horses begin to whinny and cows to low and run wildly about. One had the impression that the earth was just about to gape open and everything would be swallowed up in the abyss. Fearful bangs resounded from somewhere, shaking the earth, and the invisibility of the source inspired a kind of superstitious terror. People were literally dumbfounded. So, begins to give somewhat the impression of the eyewitnesses and why I think this would make a hell of a story that could be. So it goes on. Here's from a newspaper article by Ponomarev reporting from the village of Nizhny Ilimsk. At 7:20 a.m., a mighty noise was heard, resolving into thunder cracks. Although the sky was cloudless at the time, the noise caused houses to shake. Many inhabitants saw a fiery body like a beam shoot from south to northwest above the ground before they heard the thunder. Immediately afterwards, the bang was heard, and in the place where the fiery body had disappeared, a tongue of fire appeared, followed by a pillar of smoke.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, doesn't it? Vasily Akhchen of the Evenki people to one of the investigating scientists early on in 1926, right? So this is what happened to Vasily. He woke up at the moment when the tent, he was a reindeer herder, by the way. He woke up at the moment when the tent was torn away and he was thrown aside by a powerful jolt, but did not lose consciousness. The ground shook and loud, prolonged roaring was heard. Everything round about was shrouded in smoke and fog from the burning, falling trees. Eventually, the roar died away, the wind dropped, but the forest went on burning. All three set off in search of the reindeer, which, at the time of the catastrophe, had rushed away. Many of them did not come back and could not be traced. There was an account of some of the children that was actually set down years later who had camped near, not inside the radius of destruction, but outside, right? Because anybody who would have been inside that radius of destruction would not have, within that butterfly of destruction, would not have been giving an eyewitness account, obviously. So these children, the account of these children is that they were awakened by a loud rumble. Explosions were heard everywhere. The earth trembled, and there was a loud cracking noise. A terrible storm, during which they could hardly keep on their feet, flattened the forest near their tent. Far away towards the north, a kind of cloud was visible. And then testimony of one of the local Tunguska people who was living in a nearby village, probably some 20 miles to 30 miles from the epicenter. So he was far enough away that obviously he wasn't killed, but this is what he recalls. I don't remember the year exactly, but more than 20 years ago, when the fallow land was being plowed up, I was sitting on the porch of the house at the trading station of Vanavara at breakfast time and looking towards the north. I had just raised my axe to hoop a cask when suddenly in the north, the sky was split in two, and high above the forest, the whole northern part of the sky appeared to be covered with fire. At that moment, I felt a great heat, as if my shirt had caught fire. I wanted to pull off my shirt and throw it away, but at that moment, there was a mighty bang in the sky, and a powerful crash was heard. I was thrown to the ground about 3 sagines, which I think, as I recall, was about 28 feet. I was thrown to the ground about 3 sagines away from the porch, and for a moment I lost consciousness. My wife ran out and carried me into the hut. The crash was followed by a noise like stones falling from the sky or guns firing. The earth trembled, and when I lay on the ground, I covered my head because I was afraid that stones might hit it. At the moment when the sky opened, a hot wind as from a cannon blew past the huts from the north. Now here's the testimony of Semenov's daughter, Kosolapova. I was 19, and when the meteorite fell, I was at the trading station at Vanovara. Marfa, who was a friend of hers, and I had come to the spring for water. Marfa began to draw water, and I was standing beside her facing north. Suddenly, before me, I saw the sky in the north open to the ground, and fire poured out. We were terrified, but the sky closed again, and immediately afterwards, bangs like gunshots were heard. We thought that stones were falling from the sky and rushed off in terror, leaving our pail by the spring. I ran with my head down and covered because I was afraid that stones might fall on it. When we reached the house, we saw my father, Semenov, lying unconscious near the barn opposite the porch of the house. Marfa and I carried him into the hut. We were terribly frightened at the time, for the fire was brighter than the sun. During the bangs, the earth and the huts trembled greatly. The noises at first were very, very loud and seemed to be right above our heads. And then they became quieter and quieter. From another letter to Kulik in 1935, 1936, from the village of Kezhma, again just outside the butterfly of destruction. Naumenko was the author of this. He says, it was about 8 a.m. on the 17th or 18th of June, 1908. The day was unusually clear, and not a single cloud was to be seen. No wind stirred, and there was absolute silence. Suddenly, far off, still hardly audible, was heard the sound of thunder. It made us look up involuntarily in every direction. The sound seemed to come from beyond the river Angara and became rapidly louder. There was something extraordinary about it. The first fairly faint crash resounded, but when I turned quickly in the direction of the crash, I saw that the sun's rays were crossed by a broad, fiery white band on the right side of its rays. On the left side, towards the north, an irregularly shaped, brilliant, white, somewhat elongated mass was flying into the taiga with a diameter far greater than the moon's. Approximately 2 to 3 seconds, maybe more, after the first faint crash, a second louder crash of thunder resounded, as loud as that generally heard during a storm. After the second crash, the ball was no longer visible, but its tail, or rather the streamer, was now completely on the left side of the sun's rays. Then, after a shorter interval of time than that between the first and second crashes, the third thunder crash occurred. This was so loud, as though there were several crashes all mingled together within it, that the whole ground trembled and shook. An echo, like a continuous deafening roar, resounded through the taiga. Indeed, it seemed through the whole taiga of vast Siberia. The carpenters, after the first and second crashes, had crossed themselves in stupefaction. When the third crash resounded, they fell backwards from the building onto the chips of wood. Some of them were so stunned and utterly terrified that I had to calm them down and reassure them. We all abandoned work and went into the village. There, whole crowds of local inhabitants were gathered in the streets in terror, talking about the phenomena. So it's some juicy stuff. but it kind of
Man, that
gives us some insight.
Yeah, that last one was a really good account right there.
Yeah, it was. And there's more, but I don't know. We might be running out of time or not.
We got 10, 15 minutes.
Well, let's push on.
But yeah, certainly terrifying.
So this is an account by one Corcoran, who was sailing down the river Angara, not far from the village of Bogushani, which, you can actually find on a map. I found it to try to get the geography. In the north, a pale bluish light glowed, and from the south, a fiery body that was considerably larger than the sun and left a broad, bright streamer behind it flew across the sky. Then such a cannonade broke out that all the workmen who were in the boat rushed to hide in the cabin, forgetting all about the danger that threatened from the rapids. The first bangs were faint, but became progressively louder. The sound effect, he estimated, lasted 3 to 5 minutes. The intensity of the sounds was so great that the boatmen were completely demoralized. And here is taken from the account of Vakulin, the postmaster at Nizhny Ilimsk. At about 8 a.m. on Tuesday, 17 June, a large group of local inhabitants say they first noticed a ball of fire in the northwest, coming down obliquely to the horizon from east to west. When it approached the ground, it changed into a pillar of fire. After its disappearance, a pillar of smoke was seen rising upwards from the ground. A few minutes later, a loud noise was heard with separate deafening crashes like peals of thunder. These crashes were followed by 8 loud bangs like gunshots. The first bang was exceptionally loud and accompanied by a whistling noise. Here's another account from Kokulin, an agriculturist, in a letter to the director of the Irkutsk Observatory. The crash was heard along the Lena River from near Verkholensk to Makatoy, and I'm probably butchering these names, over a distance of about 1,300 versts. Eyewitnesses said that where the body fell, a pillar of black smoke rose up. The Tungus people wandering around the hamlet of Nizhny Karalinsk say that the thunder was the most terrible they ever heard. So you notice here, you commented, Kyle, that some of this imagery sounded familiar, didn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pillars of fire and smoke.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've been kind of taking notes on some of that. It's interesting how some of the other ones, like the sky splitting in two, the sky opening and fire pouring out. Those are pretty cool. But yeah, the pillar of fire and smoke is definitely biblical.
At the beginning of the 9th hour, in the morning local time, a ball of fire appeared in the sky and moved from southeast to northwest. As the ball approached the ground, it first took on a flattened out shape from top to bottom. And just before it struck the ground, it had the appearance of 2 pillars of fire. Same idea over and over again. When this fiery mass fell onto the ground, 2 loud crashes like thunder were heard, and then a noise like a strong wind was heard. Another one, the director of the Kurensk Meteorological Station, in a letter dated June 23rd, 1908. On the 17th of June, in the northwest of Kurensk, an extraordinary phenomena was observed. At 7:15 a.m., in the northwest, a pillar of fire appeared in the shape of a spear. When the pillar disappeared, 5 loud, sharp bangs as from a cannon followed swiftly and distinctly, one after the other, were heard, and then a dense cloud appeared on that spot. And then we have the account of Obruchev probably, who was actually a geologist traveling near the trading post of Vanavara in 1924. The area of flattened forest is about 4 days' journey away from the mouth of the Chambay River by birch bark boat. That is over 100 kilometers. In winter, it is 3 days' journey by reindeer in a direct line, about 50 to 60 kilometers. The shape of the area on the plan is distorted, but from questions answered, it would appear to be somewhat circular. The forest was completely flattened. The Avanok, Ilya Potapovich, who was living at the time at the trading post at Teterya, 25 kilometers to the southwest of Vanavara, told me that at the spot where the meteorite fell, a pit was formed from which a stream flowed to join the river Chambay. Ilya Potapovich's brother was living in the region at the time of the fall when his tent flew up into the air like a bird, in quotes. Some of his reindeer were killed by the falling trees, and he himself was deprived of speech for several years, as were a number of other people who were so stupefied by what they witnessed that they were unable to speak. Now, this idea that there was a spring or a stream which appeared and flowed forth from the epicenter or near the epicenter, I find to be very interesting. We'll come back to that idea. I think it's a very interesting idea that the shock wave may have actually opened up some subterranean hydrological conduit that then now begin to flow from the surface. And here is the account of Seryachev. And he says, I am a tanner. And in the summer, about 8 a.m., I was washing wool on the bank of the river Kan or Khan. Suddenly, a noise like the fluttering of the wings of a frightened bird was heard coming from a southeasterly direction, and a kind of swell came up the river. After this came a single sharp bang so loud that one of the workmen, Vlaslav, fell into the water. This was followed by several dull bangs like subterranean rumbling. At the first explosion, a kind of radiant body appeared in the air. It was roundish, about half the size of the moon, tinged with blue, and flew swiftly from Filomonova to Irkutsk. It left a trail behind in the form of a pale blue band that stretched over its whole path. So there was a Golashchekin from the village of Kamenskoye on the river Yenisei, 600 kilometers west-southwest of the place of the fall. Reported in a letter on the 30th June 1908 that at 7 a.m. in the village of Kamenskoye, the following phenomena were observed. 3 subterranean thunder crashes sounded from the northwest, one after the other. Some inhabitants felt the ground and buildings shake. From questioning the local inhabitants, he learned that several minutes earlier, some of them had seen, quotes, an elongated body narrowing towards one end and more than an arshine in length, which would have probably made it appear to them to be about 2 to 3 times the diameter of the sun, torn, as it were, from the sun. Its head was as bright as the sun, but the remainder was duller. The body flew across the sky and fell in the northeast. Again, many of the accounts, this is very interesting, torn as it were from the sun. And this is one reason, again, to emphasize why people did not see the thing at first, because for most of the eyewitnesses, the thing was coming from the direction of the sun. So they would have had to have been looking right in the direction of the rising sun, and this is where the thing came out of the sky.
Maybe that's a good place to leave that vision and let people think about that as we cut out till next week. What do you think?
Yeah, because there's
can you wrap
enough.
it up, pulling that together maybe with the Taurids, the summer Taurids look like they're coming from the sun. We don't see them during the day. That's the ones at Halloween that are at night.
Well, I'll tell you what we'll do is we will certainly pick up next episode and we will get into the identity of this mysterious and awesome visitor to the planet back in 1908. And yes, at that point, we'll begin to immerse ourselves in some of the extraordinary phenomena associated with the Taurid meteor stream, its place in history as well as in mythology, and see if that relates back to the Tunguska episode. And as we're going through these eyewitness accounts, what I want to do is pick out specific details, like this detail example here, torn as it were from the sun. Absolutely. You see, that's a very important clue that helps us to identify who this mysterious cosmic visitor was. And so, we'll pick up the story. We'll extract the lessons that I think are germane to our understanding of the Younger Dryas episodes. And that's how we're essentially going off on a tangential pathway, but we'll see that it'll come back to the main trail. And when we come back to the main trail, I think we'll have deeper insight, or at least have a better framework for addressing some of the questions raised by the Younger Dryas. And I was just beginning to wonder, where's Brad's hat?
There it is.
There it is.
Gonna make it the normal deal.
That's right. I also noticed, just briefly, dragon imagery. There was the forked tongue of flame coming out of the... Lots of interesting mythological style pictures and lots
of imagery emerging from these accounts. Yes, and that's the value of them, and that's why I'm going through these accounts so that we can see those parallels.
Yeah, it's outstanding. Totally worthwhile. I'm riveted to hear more.
Yeah. So join us next week, everybody. Meantime, you can get a hold of us, Kosmographia1618@gmail.com. Check the website. Contact@thecabin.com if you want to go on the trips. Everything else is in the show notes. We thank you all for the Patreon support and other ways of supporting. Thank you guys so much. And we're going to close it out with this video of near-Earth objects.
Yes.
Right?
Okay, we're gonna conclude with that. Yeah, JPL animation to show the evolving census of near-Earth objects.
That's right. So
you should probably do a little voiceover, Randall. Explain what's going on.
Well, it's got captions. It will explain. So we'll. I've talked enough, if that's okay, and we'll just let the video run. It will. Yeah. Here we go. From 1999 to 2018. So we'll kind of pick it up. We left that first graphic off right around 1999, when there was 1,500 known. So here we go. Yes, here we are, January 1st. Notice the Earth, blue ring, third ring out from the sun, 2009 and 2018.
It's just a few.
Right? Are we beginning to realize now that we live in a densely populated solar system?
I think so.
I think indeed we are. And what does that mean? What are the implications of this for our future? And I think that part of what we're trying to do with this podcast is not just to look at this interesting phenomena, but really to try to develop a context for understanding how these kinds of insights would affect the future of planetary civilization.
That's good.
Outstanding.
Yep. Excellent.
Be back
good night,
next
gentlemen.
week.
Yeah. Next week.
Thanks.
Next week. Goodbye, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Mike.